Look, thank you very much for giving up your lunchtime to come and have a listen to the presentation today. To give you some background as to how this has evolved, so Gavin asked me to come and talk about the northern dog. I said, look, I'm kind of a bit over that really. I've kind of been talking about this for a while. Why don't we do something different? And I have two colleagues who've been working with numbers as well, and so Nick Pawsey, who's an accountant, who's making a real contribution in terms of unravelling some of the magic of water numbers, and Bethany Cooper, who some of you of course would know through the Society, who's also done some really interesting work around preferences. So we thought we'd cobble together a quick presentation, so we're hoping that we're only going to take about 5 minutes each to give you something to digest. And in essence, the presentation is kind of just to spark a conversation about why we need to be so careful about where numbers come from when we talk about water. Before I move into that though, as Dave mentions, we have done a lot of work within our little group, so we do have a group, so Sue O'Keefe's here, so part of this work of course relates to some of the work that Sue's done. Alistair Watson also works with us on this stuff. So there is a group, we're called the Centre for Water Policy Management, but those of you know anything about universities, it's a bit of a moving feast, although there's not much feasting at times. So today's presentation has three components, and really the theme, I guess, is about why the story behind the numbers is so important, and it's important for us to think about what drives those numbers. And as I've indicated, we'll try and touch on three topics. I'll quickly talk about the northern dog. Then Nick will talk about some of the accounting nuances and how if you tweak them, you get very different outcomes when you plug them into an economic model like a DEA. And Bethany will talk about how we've managed to get different numbers for willingness to pay. I guess the upshot of this, for those of you who are consultants, one of the ways you could approach this is to say, well, tell us what you want, and then we can tweak the numbers to make sure, sorry, I shouldn't say that. Tell us what you want in advance, and then that'll save a lot of bother. We can just tweak it, make sure it comes out the way you like. So many of you, as I look around the room, are grey enough to remember things like the northern dog. You would remember that a decade ago, of course, it was very, very dry. And this once-in-a-century plan was going to fix lots of things. We have a pipeline that costs $625 million. And of course, the different retailers have also thrown in $100 million each in order to secure access to entitlements that was to be delivered. The share for Melbourne, of course, was supposed to be 75 gigalitres, was supposed to be delivered by 2010. And I'll talk a little bit more about the nuances that attend that in a moment. So is there anybody who doesn't know about the North-South Pipeline? Good. Okay, of course, what happened with the change in government, there was a promise, I guess, that was made that the pipeline would have effectively been plugged. Perhaps that's, some people who want to speak that up a bit differently in terms of its access for water for fighting fires and so forth, but in essence, the pipeline has been plugged. The other big nuance here, of course, is that the rules are such that the Minister can, of course, order water from the desal, which effectively could forestall the triggering of the access to the pipeline indefinitely, really, as far as I can tell. So, I did want to just kind of talk, in my allotted 5 minutes or so, talk briefly about kind of the benefits and costs, and to try and unravel some of those numbers so you get a bit of a sense in terms of how those numbers stack up. There is a published version of this paper which sits within economic papers. So if you want to access the full story, you can do so there. But there are kind of two issues, I guess, that I'm interested in. One is, what are the financial consequences of these decisions? And then the second issue of interest to me is, what is the legacy of these? What's the legacy? And the legacy, I guess, manifests in some of the policies that have materialised in places like OLV. I'm not going to talk about the second today because we'd be chewing through lunch for too long, but I do want to just talk quickly about the first, which is some of the benefits and costs and how they stack up. So, as I noted at the start, the pipeline, in effect, came at a cost of $625 million. It's now an asset, of course, that belongs to Melbourne Water, and each of the retailers tipped in $100 million. But there are a range of technical matters that relate to this, and I've written a lot about this topic, and it's still a fierce topic of debate, and And to be honest, I just came back from Pakistan last week, and one of the things that annoys me most about rich countries like Australia promoting water use efficiency is that we can piss money out the door and it really doesn't make a lot of difference. But when you start to do dopey things in places like Pakistan and promote water use efficiency for the sake of it, you end up with really serious outcomes for folk who don't have enough to eat. So one of the consequences of this particular project, of course, was that we decided that we could save water magically. But of course, infrastructure cannot save water in itself. Despite the universal appeal of this argument, really there's only two ways you can save water with this sort of infrastructure that we've deployed in the north of the state. One is to make sure that you're intercepting water that you know is definitely going to a saline sink. And the second, of course, is to know exactly how much you're losing through evaporation and then compensate for that. So whilst people are quite happy to talk about water being lost from the system, regrettably this is not always particularly precise, which makes sense when you think about the Auditor General in 2008 noting that the project in northern Victoria, really the numbers around it were quite rubbery, and they were quite concerned that the auditing of the so-called savings would be problematic. So what we now have is an auditing process which exists, and that's great, but it might well explain why instead of 75 gigalitres we end up with much more than what we originally thought. I guess the sad thing for Melburnians is that they paid for this up front, despite the vagaries of the water accounting. So you do need to understand that any water that is supposedly saved as a result of water accounting then doesn't materialise on an entitlement until some time later, after it has been audited and then converted to some sort of long-term average. So I haven't updated the numbers here, and I apologise for that. I've been a bit busy trying to save jobs and so forth. But in 2011-12, for example, Melbourne's water retailers technically had access to 27.952 gigalitres. Bear in mind that in 2010, the forecast was that they were supposed to have 75 gigalitres. So the most we could get to is 57.952. Now, because the pipeline has been plugged, and effectively you can't transfer that to Melbourne, it means that this water is carried over. But of course, when you carry it over, the accounting rules are such that you lose 5% due to evaporation, and of course, because it's sitting there as carryover, it is also the first water to spill from the dam. The upshot was that when you look at the numbers for the next year, 2012-13, what was 57.952 gigalitres is now 51.597 gigalitres. So fortunately, I guess, the Minister did approve the sale of some of the allocation that attends some of this entitlement, so that in 2013, between March and May, the retailers were at least able to recoup about $1 million by selling 21 gigs of that on the market. So it's not all bad news per se, but when you look at the water plans that went in from the different retailers, so South East Water, for example, has predicted that by selling some of the selling some of the allocation, they're anticipating that they'll be able to go from about $600,000 in 2013-14 up to $1 million by 2017-18. But this has to be offset by the cost of holding the water. So bulk water charges, they've estimated, will go from about 300k to 700k, and this is the one that really excites people in Melbourne. You'll get to pay a regional urban storage ancillary fee, which is a fee which is charged because apparently water that's held by urban people attracts more cost than water that's held by other people. As a result of that, the net outcome is likely to be that South East Water and the others are likely to end up with pretty much loose change. They'll end up with about $300,000 per year from a $100 million investment. So these realities show up on the balance sheets of the various water retailers here, and that they appear in statutory accounting disclosures for those utilities. All three retailers report their share of the entitlement at acquisition cost. So each of the retailers report this at acquisition cost, $100 million. These appear as part of the intangible assets disclosed on the balance sheet of the water utilities and also make up a significant component of their assets. Now, because that feeds into the regulatory asset base as well, this basically means that Melburnians are required to pay a guaranteed and indefinite return on these assets even though you can't use them. So I'll close there and turn quickly to Nick, who's really more the accounting specialist, to expose some of those other vagaries of numbers.
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks for coming. So, as an accountant, I'm interested in infrastructure values, and specifically from my recent research, the reliability of the infrastructure values of Victorian water businesses. So I think it's an important area because infrastructure values influence a number of areas. So they drive water prices, so water businesses are permitted to generate a return on their regulatory asset base, and they're permitted to recoup depreciation through their water prices. It's also important to get infrastructure values right because they flow on and impact the KPIs, the financial performance indicators, and they can potentially impact economic efficiency scores, which are commonly used as part of initiatives to promote competition by comparison. So it's a complex area because the water businesses have to keep two sets of asset values. So they've got to keep a set of asset values for statutory purposes in accordance with the Australian equivalents of international financial reporting standards, and in accordance with all the DTF guidance and ministerial reporting directives. And in accordance with those rules, they're now required to measure infrastructure at fair value. So they've only relatively recently been applying fair value accounting, having moved away from historic cost accounting in 2010 in the metropolitan context, and in 2011 in relation to other water businesses in Victoria. So if we compare those rules with the regulatory rules that the ESC uses to set the regulatory asset base, they're not allowed to revalue those asset bases. And the asset bases themselves were initially set by the Minister back in 2004. So when the Minister initially set the regulatory asset values of the metropolitan water businesses, they set the regulatory assets above the statutory values. In relation to the regional urban water businesses, they decided to set the regulatory asset values below the statutory values. And in relation to the rural water businesses, they set the regulatory asset bases at zero. So if we look at all the different asset values floating around today, if we look at the metropolitan context, we see statutory values, regulatory values are different. And if we compare the statutory values under a historic cost measurement approach versus a fair value measurement, again we see that there's some difference. And the difference flows through across the sector. If we look at regional urban businesses, and if we look at rural water businesses. So why does it all matter? So in a paper that Lynn and I did, we said, well, what would the revenue requirement of water businesses look like if we use the statutory values instead of the regulatory values? And we saw that in many instances, the water prices would need to go up quite substantially. So if we look at the move from historic cost accounting to fair value accounting for statutory reporting purposes, it had a dramatic impact on the depreciation charges of the water businesses and therefore the operating results. And so it has an influence on how well we perceive the water business to be performing from their statutory businesses, from their statutory accounts. The move to fair value accounting for statutory reporting purposes has also had an impact on many of the financial performance indicators that the Minister requires the water businesses to report back to them as part of their annual reporting purposes. So further complication in relation to statutory values is the fact that many businesses assume different useful lives for their infrastructure. So while many businesses assume that the useful life of their infrastructure is less than 150 years, some water businesses estimate that the useful life of their infrastructure is up to 400 years. And if you use 150 years useful life versus 400 useful life for depreciation purposes, it's going to have a dramatic impact on your major expense and a dramatic impact on your operating result. And a further complication relates to the fact that since being forced to revalue their infrastructure, many water businesses have elected to extend the useful life of the infrastructure in order to try and manage the potentially try and manage the impact of the revalued, fair value depreciation charges. So with our colleague Ananda, another area which we've been looking at in terms of the influence of infrastructure values is in relation to economic efficiency assessments. So a technique that Ananda is skilled at is DEA analysis, data and development analysis. And so to do a DEA study, we need to make some assumptions about the inputs and the outputs and specify our model. And different studies choose different inputs and outputs. If we just take infrastructure as a potential input, some people exclude it altogether because of all the accounting issues and for other grounds. Other people include infrastructure as an input. Some measure it at historic cost, some measure it at fair value. Some measure infrastructure in physical terms, such as kilometres of pipe. So we sought out to explore how would our DEA scores change if we take a different infrastructure input. And so we looked at the 3 metropolitan water businesses in Victoria and the 13 regional urban businesses over the study, over the period 2006 through 13, and we prepared 4 DEA models. One in which the infrastructure was measured in physical terms, another in which we measured infrastructure using historic cost, another where we used the regulatory values, and another where we used the infrastructure at fair value. So we looked at the different models and saw how the efficiency scores changed, and we found there was a significant difference in the result. And we explored the consistency of rankings between different models. So in this table here, I've got the regional urban sector, the efficiency rankings when we use the historic cost infrastructure value versus a regulatory asset value versus a physical asset value. And we compared the consistency of the different models in identifying the top quarter of firms and the bottom quarter of firms. And sometimes for years we had one model saying the firm was in the top 4, and in another model they were in the bottom 4. So they weren't very consistent in identifying either the top quarter of firms or the bottom quarter of firms over the study period. And so again, when we compared the DEA efficiency scores using fair values or historic cost, again we got quite different results in terms of which firms do we think are in the top quarter and the bottom quarter, and they weren't that consistent in identifying those quartiles. So I think if competition by comparison is the focus of regulation, then we need to think about how much of the result is driven by infrastructure valuation issues and how much is driven by actual operating concerns. And another example of an economic technique in which valuations is important is state of preference techniques, and I'll hand you over to Bethany to discuss that.
Okay, so state of preference techniques like DEA that Nick was just talking about are increasingly being used to inform urban water planners. So basically, state of preference techniques such as choice modelling and contingent valuation have been used to try and put a value on the welfare costs of different policy responses such as urban water restrictions in the context of urban water planning. And these values have then been used as a basis to inform certain policy decisions such as investment in water supplies. So this raises question as to whether the values generated by state of preference techniques conducted under particular drought conditions are a reliable basis for committing expenditures on costly, long-lasting infrastructure. So for example, a number of desalination plants have been built in response to the welfare losses due to drought. These now look quite excessive after a number of wetter years. So in terms of state of preference techniques in the literature, there's been a lot of work done on looking at the effects of framing choice experiments and continued valuation experiments. And these have been shown to actually influence measured utility. There is, however, limited research in the literature that actually looks at how the contextual factors impact the measured utility. So, for example, was the study conducted in a period of drought, or was it conducted after a period of wetter years? So there's been very limited investigation into that. So a paper that I presented recently at the World Congress of Environment and Resource Economics actually did some preliminary investigation into whether studies conducted during drought had a material or significant difference in the willingness to pay to those conducted after a series of wetter years. So the first sample was a continued evaluation experiment conducted during drought, so during 2008, and the second sample was then conducted with the same cities in 2011, so after the drought had broken. So the aim of this particular paper was to see if there is a significant difference in the welfare estimates across these particular cities during these different times. So the study did provide some preliminary insight into the variations of preferences across the cities and also over time and against changing characteristics. So just very quickly, and you can refer to the paper to go into the detail about the study and the sample and the modelling, but it was conducted across 6 cities, so in New South Wales and Victoria. It drew on metropolitan and regional cities and also cities with very different water supply histories. The same design was used, as I said, the paper goes into detail about this, and the same modelling approach was held constant across the 2 samples. So just to very quickly summarise the main findings, there was no clear pattern as to what was happening with the changes. So some cities were showing a significant increase in willingness to pay, some were showing no change, no significant change across the periods, and some were showing a significant decrease in willingness to pay. So there's actually no clear pattern as to what was happening across the 2 contexts. So you can see that the metros, Melbourne and Sydney, there's been a significant increase. Bendigo and Goulburn, so they were considered sort of the water poorer cities initially during the drought, but no significant change. And then Albury-Wodonga had a significant decrease. So from a policy perspective, that you can see that there is a significant difference in the willingness to pay across different climate settings. And there is actually...
Can you give me an example of what sort of question people are asked? They're not asked, we just had a drought for a few years. Suppose we'd had desal. So would it be worth $50 a year to you, or $100? Or what are the questions?
So the question, so it was a continued valuation experiment. So with these studies, people in this case were asked how much they were willing to pay to avoid water restrictions. So the modelling then allows you to put a value on the welfare loss of being subject to water restrictions. So that's what the value is. So this preliminary insight into the changes or whether they're increasing or decreasing, this is important for policy as major infrastructure projects, so such as desal plants, are being built in response to prolonged drought, and these decisions are in part based on the rationale that water restrictions are imposing a welfare loss on households, and they're willing to pay to avoid water restrictions. So these stated preference techniques are being used to actually put the value on that welfare loss that is then being used in benefit cost analysis to inform these decisions. So this study showed that welfare estimates can actually materially change. Okay, so just to summarise, so Nick and Lynn, we've all talked about how numbers have been applied in different case studies to inform water policy. So it's important to actually know how your number was actually collected and when it was actually collected, and the technique that it was used to collect it as well, to inform policy. So I guess we wanted to create conversation about being cautious about how the numbers were actually achieved to inform water policy.
As opposed to offering ourselves to give you a number that suits,
Yes.
which of course wouldn't be accepted. Okay, so anybody got questions?